As for rockets, they weren't for flying, they were for fireworks. But it all changed pretty damn quick. We got into a race. Putting a man on a rocket became the most important thing in the world. And I figured it ought to be me. That's the test pilot's nature. He wants to be first. The finish line. That's what the moon was. A brand new runway. Fate, luck, the Russians, whatever it was, put us in the spotlight. And flying the thing was only half the job. The other half was making it look easy. And that's the part no one saw. It was never easy, never safe, never routine. I guarantee you never heard the real story. It was a hell of a ride.
Britain, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
A lot had changed since I started out. Back then, the only thing that mattered was flying. That's me, Slayton. Major Donald K. My friends call me Deke. Going faster, farther, higher was all we cared about. 10 years had passed. Now it was 1967. The moon was the center of my life. And right then it felt pretty damn close. Down on pad 34, the moon rocket was ready for its first flight. Pad 34. Man, if this place could talk.
You remember the time on your flight when you said you didn't want to ride down to the pad? We were doing some kind of a test. You didn't want to ride down to the pad in that old cattle car we had. So you took the vet down with the top down. You had the little walk-around ventilator.
Old stories still being told. These guys remember. Some of my good buddies. Scotty, John, Gordo, and old Al. Alan B. Shepard, America's first man in space. He and I were the only ones from that first group to see it all.
What do you remember like Gus? What do you want Gus? You gotta say Gus here.
Gus was a man of few words, but you could hang your hat on anything he said.
Gus, what do you think your chances are for an Apollo flight?
I think it's pretty good. I expect to be around for most of the Apollo program.
You think you will one day make one of the trips to the moon, then?
I'm planning on it.
Gus Grissom. Not much on water skis, but a hell of a pilot and a damn good engineer. He liked to have a good time as much as the rest of us. But when it came to work, there was an intensity you could cut with a knife.
Gus was a charger. He was a very macho type. He was really the typical test pilot. But he also had go fever. You know, he wanted to get it going. He wanted to get up there and do the job.
Gus was our second man in space, and he flew a perfect mission. But that wasn't what people remembered. What they remembered was he'd lost his ship.
And somehow Gus got tagged with making a mistake because he lost the spacecraft, and you were not allowed a mistake.
Did I feel that I was in danger at any time during the flight or in the water? Well, I was scared a good portion of the time. I guess this is a pretty good indication.
You were what?
Scared. Okay?
Test pilots lose planes. It happens. But this wasn't the test pilot business anymore. This was the astronaut business. When it goes right, you get a parade and a trip to the White House. When it goes wrong, you get a reputation.
It hurt him very, very much. It's very easy to blame the astronaut, but that wasn't Gus. Gus was much too great an engineer and too serious a pilot.
He got tagged as the astronaut who'd lost his ship. Gus hated the reputation, but he didn't run away from it. He stuck it right in everybody's face. On his next flight, He named his spacecraft the Unsinkable Molly Brown.
Gus was very intense, very, very intense about the problem he had with his Mercury flight, very intense about sort of disappearing out of the system. So he made his Gemini flight a perfect Gemini flight.
This time the ending was perfect, too. After splashdown, he got seasick, puked his guts out, but he wouldn't open that hatch until the chopper had a firm grip on the capsule. He'd made his point. Gus wanted that first Apollo ride. Now he would get it. Apollo, a moon ship for a 500,000-mile journey. The most impressive flying machine ever built. It made the Mercuries and Geminis we'd been flying look like something from the Wright brothers. This was probably the most complex thing ever put together by humans. As much technology as a nuclear submarine crammed into the package the size of a minivan. The electrical system alone had 30 miles of wire.
I'm real pleased to be on the first flight and looking forward to it. I just now started getting into the Apollo systems and looking at Apollo spacecraft and trying to forget everything I knew about Gemini. I think we've got a real good crew with Ed and Roger.
Ed White was the best athlete in the astronaut corps and the first American to walk in space. A real mom and apple pie type. After John Glenn left the program, Ed stepped right into his shoes.
I had a great faith in the people and the equipment that we were using for the mission. I had a great faith in myself, and especially in Jim. And also, I think I had a great faith in my own God.
I remember after his flight, he insisted on putting in his life personal contract story the question of how did you feel when you got out on the first spacewalk. And he told the life reporter, I felt red, white, and blue all over. And I went to Ed and I said, come on, Ed, we're all patriotic, but that's bullshit. He said, nope, that stays.
I feel like $1 million.
Just like it. That's the way I felt.
Roger Chaffee had flown a U-2 over Cuba during the missile crisis. He took the pictures of the Russian rockets Kennedy showed on TV. Apollo 1 would be his first space flight. There was a lot to learn, and not enough hours in the day to learn it, but there was no time to slow down. We were on a roll. On top of that, there was always the Russians. They were never far from our thoughts.
We had a general idea what the Soviets were doing. But I don't know, do you ever remember getting a briefing with anybody in the CIA that would give us an inkling as to what the Soviets were doing back in those days?
No, I think...
We knew that they were planning to go to the moon. We had satellite photographs at that time that showed us the development of their launch stand. Then they also showed us the vehicle as it was brought into position.
The Russians weren't the only pressure. We'd been keeping our heads down since 1959, eating, sleeping, breathing spaceflight. While we weren't looking, America had changed.
The worst race riots since those 2 years ago in the...
While we'd been trying to figure out how to join spacecraft together, the country was figuring out how to tear itself apart. A lot of our friends were fighter pilots, and they were starting to get shot down over a place called Vietnam. President Johnson was feeling the heat. He thought it was about time America got some good news. He looked around, and NASA seemed like a pretty good messenger.
Everybody had go fever, meaning, we've got to go. We've got to keep up with the schedule. We've got to get to the moon and back before the end of this decade. We're on a timeline. We've got to do these things in this order. If we don't do them right now in this order, we're going to lose our place. We'll slip the launch.
We were only too eager to deliver. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that shiny new moon ship. So far, the Apollo 1 spacecraft looked a hell of a lot better than it performed.
The spacecraft had been delivered, but of course we had lived with it for, many, many months before at the contractor's plant, North American Rockwell. And we knew that the spacecraft was, in poor shape relative to what it ought to be. We felt like we could fly it, but let's face it, it just wasn't as good as it should have been for the job of flying the first manned Apollo mission.
We were dealing with new contractors who had their own ideas on how they were going to do things. All of the history of Mercury and Gemini was put aside, and the knowledge of the people that got us that far was also put aside. You don't throw your history away, you learn from it, and that's why I called it Project Appalling.
Late January, 4 weeks to launch. We were working around the clock, testing system by system.
We were going very fast. NASA was behind schedule as always. And we were running tests without taking time to really look at the data.
The last check was called the plugs out test, a full dress rehearsal for launch. It was a Friday at the end of an awfully long week, and we were tired. We all had our eyes on the weekend.
In the morning when the crew came in to the office, I sensed something. I don't know what it was that I sensed, but I picked up something from all three of them. There was a quietness about them. Instead of being ready for a test where they usually just get up and bounce out the door, it was something they didn't want to do. Their attitude was 180 from anything I've ever seen before.
It would be actual flight conditions. Crew in full suits, capsule under its own power, 100% oxygen inside, and the hatch sealed.
It's not a normal workday. You stayed there till the test was done, which meant that you might be in that spacecraft 18, 20 hours. It was a long, arduous test.
This one was no different. We'd been going since 6 in the morning.
I said to Gus, if it doesn't check out well, if you have a glitch or an anomaly, get the hell out of there.
Hell, he wasn't going to do that. That would have brought the program to a stop, and everybody said, well, that chicken shit guy and all that kind of stuff.
You've got a cast of thousands geared up to perform a test, and you're critical to that test, and here you are, you've worked all day long, and you're down to the last half hour, last hour. It's very difficult to just say, hey, I'm putting everything to a stop here.
I was in the blockhouse with Stu Russo, late Friday afternoon.
We had some communication problems. We were having trouble. We were testing out the various loops and radios.
Okay, we're ready to pick up, Chuck, but all I can do is give it a try. You copy? No, I don't read you at all, Chuck. You want to try the phone? Hey, guys, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between two buildings? I can't hear a thing you're saying. Did you guys say something from the command module? I said, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between two buildings?
The test was dragging on, one glitch after another. Most of us had already called to say we wouldn't be home for dinner. And then it happened. Down under Gus's seat, somewhere in 30 miles of wire, there was a short circuit. In the blockhouse, all we saw was another glitch on the meter. Nobody knew it then, but a spark had jumped out. It landed and sat there, in the pure oxygen, At 15 pounds pressure, it glowed. Brighter and brighter.
4, 3, 2, 1, mark. CLTC 121. You're cleared for launch.
And then it went. Like a blowtorch. I called for medics and raced over to the pad. The radio was dead, but I still hadn't given up on the crew. In their suits, I figured maybe they still had a chance. The pad guys were burning their hands trying to get the damned hatch off, choking in toxic smoke. Almost as fast as it started, the fire was out. Finally, they got the hatch off. And then we knew.
Most of their suits were still white. You did not look in and see charred bodies.
We always expected to lose someone, someday, but not on the ground. That was not a way to die, not for a test pilot. The moon that had seemed so close now had vanished from sight.
Early in the morning, I got in a T-38 and flew to the Cape, and I never will forget that flight.
Within hours of the fire, we had put Frank Borman in charge of our investigation.
All along the way, the controllers were saying, yeah, we're sorry, and this and that. To me, that portrayed the whole feeling of the country. It was an enormous setback, and everybody felt it.
I mean, we were really shocked because we had just left the guys and come back, and
none of us could talk. I mean, we just kind of just looked at each other. Eyes were full of pain.
Devastating to the people in the program. I mean, just devastating. I mean, sent a wave of pain.
Oh, I'll never forget the pain in Al Shepard's eyes and his face. I'll never forget
When I
that.
got home, boy, I lost it all. That was a very traumatic experience. You know, you kept going, what could I have done? What could we have done?
Gus was one of the 7. I mean, there was a bonding there that they had, no matter whatever happened.
The 7 original astronauts were now 6.
I think the American public is mature enough to recognize that it's an important program. It's a program that must go on. And if something should happen, why, well, it happened. We still have to go on living every day, and we go on and continue the program.
I remember that Max Faget and Deke Slayton and I, we were at the Cape for the investigation. We went out one night and got bombed. I'm not proud to say, I don't drink anymore, but we got bombed that night. Ended up throwing glasses like a scene out of an old World War I movie. But then the next day, that was it.
It was back to work, on a new and painful job. How could it have happened? Everybody put aside what they'd been doing and started looking for answers. But as soon as we stopped and looked at what we'd been doing, really looked, the answers were suddenly very clear.
We had crap in that spacecraft that wouldn't quit. Had a big sponge foam pad, highly combustible. We had Velcro. The thing was wallpapered with Velcro, with an adhesive that was highly flammable and toxic. Everything was wrong. Everything was wrong.
We put 100% oxygen into that vehicle and then pressurized it. Now, we'd done that all through Gemini, all through Mercury, and we were doing that in Apollo. And nobody stood up and said, hey, you guys know what you got when you pressurize 100% oxygen? You got a bomb sitting there.
Sure, we took risks. It's part of the job. You don't always know how it'll turn out. But there was something else. The insane work schedule. The disease we called go fever.
We'd gotten too much of a goddamn hurry. We were willing to put up with a lot of poor hardware and poor preparation in order to try to get on with the job, and a lot of us knew that we were doing that.
That time frame was the worst I can remember. I was grounded, Shepard was grounded, and now the whole damn space program was grounded. I was miserable, but Al was worse, and he took it out on everybody.
I was just man at the world. I rapidly became known as the icy commander, with not too much allowance for mistakes or frivolity or lack of performance among the astronauts.
I'm sure the American public will greatly appreciate seeing the real Alan Shepard.
I remember he'd walk into the astronaut office, and he'd walk in with his briefcase and slam it down on a desk, and the other astronauts would sit in the room, and they'd kind of, well, he's in that kind of a mood today.
We had an arrangement with Lola Morrow that have her put on the door a smiling Al or a very steely-eyed Al picture.
Many times the guys wouldn't even make it by the secretary's desk. They just take one look at the picture, turn around, and leave the icy commander to his own devices.
I can remember a time or two when I was walking down the hall and I saw Al coming out, and I'd break off into another hallway and go around.
On the 6th anniversary of his Mercury flight, we threw a party. Put a little movie together to remind him of his flight status.
Only two had gone before, fellow pioneers into the unknown, Ham and Enos. Al studied their training procedures. He utilized their proven medical staff.
And I had thought briefly about getting up and interrupting at the microphone, but all of a sudden I realized there were two guys standing behind me. Each of them weighed about 250 pounds, and there was no way that Shepard was going to get out of that chair.
Good old Al. 6 years an astronaut, 15 minutes in space. He got the message. The icy commander loosened up. But that didn't make time go any faster. The new spacecraft was still a year away. And the Russians were up to something. The biggest rocket ever launched, capable of reaching the moon. All we knew at the time was that it had gone into Earth orbit. The pilot was named Vladimir Komarov. After it was all over, we learned the full story. His spacecraft started spinning out of control. The ground crew did all they could, but it was no use. They knew he wasn't going to make it. Premier Kosygin told him he'd get a hero's burial. And they got his wife on the radio to say goodbye. But he said he wasn't ready to die just yet. He fought the controls, and against all odds, he managed to re-enter safely. The chute popped out right on schedule. But just when it looked like he'd made it, that chute got twisted up like a washcloth being wrung out. It never opened. They kept their promise. They buried him a hero.
We are very saddened by the loss of Colonel Komarov. We feel comradeship for this test pilot because we've met several of his fellow cosmonauts.
I couldn't escape the irony. both sides racing forward at breakneck speed, both stumbling at the same moment. The only question now was who'd get up first. October 1968, 21 months since the fire. Apollo was ready to try again. Sitting on the Saturn rocket was the brand new spacecraft.
We felt like the spacecraft that we were going to fly was such a difference and a marked change and an upgrade from what had essentially killed, Gus and Roger and Ed, that we were very pleased. I mean, we thought we had a wonderful flying machine, and all we had to do was to go out and prove that, in fact, that it was a wonderful flying machine.
Apollo 7 was ready. The commander would be one of the original Mercury astronauts. The program's rebirth was riding on his shoulders. The stage was set for the return of Wally Schirra.
I had fun with Mercury. I had fun with Gemini. I lose a buddy, my next-door neighbor, Gus, one of our 7. I lose 2 other guys I thought the world of. And I began to realize this was no longer fun. I was now assigned a mission where I had to put it back on track, like Humpty Dumpty.
Everyone felt the change. The old Wally loved to joke around. The new Wally was dead serious. He wanted to keep the mission simple. He was tough, and he was in charge. Finally, 21 months after the fire, we were back. The new Apollo moonship was in Earth orbit and flying beautifully. Flying with Wally were 2 rookies, Walt Cunningham and Don Isley. To them, Wally was the old master.
Wally liked center stage, and the first Apollo flight was going to be center stage, and Wally's juices were flowing again.
The flight was going like clockwork. Then Mission Control wanted to change the flight plan. Experiments, little jobs that had nothing to do with flying. Just the kind of thing Wally always hated. He called them junk, and he had had enough.
They decided on a Saturday morning, we launched on a Friday, to turn on television. I was asleep, and Don Isley was on watch. And I heard Don saying something about, Wally's not going to like that.
Roger, regarding the flight plan problem here, we would just ask to reconsider that.
And they said, well, the NASA PR guys want to have television today because they've got some quiet time. They can get national media. I said, sorry about that, guys. We're not ready yet.
We have a new vehicle up here, and I'm saying at this point TV will be delayed without any further discussion until after the rendezvous.
Roger, copy.
From then on, it was one thing after another. The first war in space, and the Russians weren't even involved.
Okay, Don, go ahead, Wally.
I've had it up here today, and from now on I'm going to be an onboard flight director for these updates. We're not going to accept any new games, like getting 50 feet to the Delta Z tower for a burn, or doing some crazy tests we've never heard of before. As a result, each test is going to be reviewed thoroughly before we act on it.
I was the flight director, the prime flight director, and I was on council at the time. And I was pissed off about it. That was an affront and inappropriate and, frankly, insubordinate.
Don and I would just, kind of look at each other and cringe inside at some of the exchanges that were going on. Keep in mind that, Wally had been around. This was his 3rd mission, and he was kind of the cock of the walk, or at least he thought he was.
They were fighting like children, and I was in the middle. I'd never seen Wally so cranky before. But then Wally had never had a head cold in space before.
I've taken 2 aspirin, and I'm wondering if there's anything else I can take.
Roger. Wally, Houston here. Good doctors are recommending that you take 1 Actifed.
Hey, listen, let's go over this re-entry thing one more time since we got a little slack here and good communications. Let me tell you
one of the things I plan on doing after we break off the runs today is put on my suit and see how we stand. In the couch with the helmet off.
Roger.
The last straw was over the helmets, and it was a real battle. Mission rules said keep them on during re-entry. But with Wally's cold, He wanted to be able to hold his nose to clear the pressure in his ears.
In this case, I had a cold, and I felt that I had enough discussion with the ground. I didn't have much more time to talk about whether I'm going to put the helmet on or off, leave the bubble helmet on or off. I said, essentially, I'm on board. I'm commanding. They could wear all the black armbands they wanted if I was lost or lost my hearing, but I had the responsibility for living through the mission.
Finally, Chris Kraft gave a direct order. Wear the helmet. Wally gave a direct answer. No way.
That's pure bullshit. I think Schirra was paranoid.
What is something nice about me?
Apollo 7 was the only flight of its type. It was the only time when, in flight, the flight crews were openly difficult to deal with and hostile towards some of the things that we were trying to do.
Paranoid and Jekyll Hyde might come out of all that, but I really wanted to do everything perfectly.
The flight was a complete success, and 10 days of bickering were finally over.
Deke took Wally into one of the rooms, and Wally and Deke had it out.
Wally and I had a little talk, but it didn't do much good. Before they'd even lifted off, Wally had announced it would be his last flight. He was beyond discipline. But Chris Kraft had to have discipline. Astronauts obey orders or they don't fly. So Walt and Don were the scapegoats.
I learned at one time that Chris Kraft had listened to all of this nonsense going back and forth from the ground to the spacecraft and said that he didn't want any of those guys ever flying for him again. Chris has denied that he ever said that.
I said the only way Cunningham will ever fly again is over my dead body. And he called me on the phone and asked me if that was the case, and I said, you got it straight from the horse's mouth.
The two other guys never did fly again. But Wally? Well, he went on to achieve a different kind of fame.
It's the nasal decongestant antihistamine tablet.
The great line, of course, where I got a Clio for that was, did you ever sneeze in one of these? And here's that same bubble helmet.
Can you imagine sneezing in one of these? I'm Wally Schirra. Suffering cold symptoms in space can't be fun.
It was only 3 weeks after my flight.
We still sit around and talk about it. How we devoted 8 years of our lives to the space program. Yet the moon seemed further away than ever.
Figured with us old guys would be retired by then. These young guys could do it.
How'd you sneak back in there?
Yeah, very, very lucky to do it. It was the attitude everybody had.
But then all the work started to pay off. There was a change. Things started coming together. We knew the spacecraft could do its job. All we needed now was a rocket. Saturn V. It would carry the spacecraft, the lunar lander, the crew, and everything they would need for a trip across 500,000 miles. 2 weeks in deep space. The biggest rocket ever made. It had to lift 50 tons straight in the air, not counting its own weight, and push it up to 24,000 miles an hour.
It was an unbelievable, tremendous creation. It was real. The Saturn V was alive. You know, you'd almost had to fall in love with that beast to feel comfortable riding on top of it. So I guess the thing that probably hit me more strongly than anything else was that I want to be on one of those things, and I kept thinking that was our outlet to the moon.
But it had never been tested, and nobody was going to ride it until it had. There were only 2 years left in Kennedy's decade. If this thing worked, we had a shot at the moon. If not, all the improvements we made to the brand new Apollo spacecraft wouldn't mean a damn thing. It was time to light the candle. It was the biggest rocket in the world. And finally, it was operational. It had been 10 years since Sputnik started the whole race. We hadn't heard from the Russians in a while, but after all our hard work and all our success, it was going to come right down to the wire.
We were told by Deke that the CIA had a indication that the Russians were going to try to circumnavigate the moon prior to the end of '68. And that was a driving force and I think one of the major considerations in the Apollo 8 decision. Well, for once, let's preempt them.
I think unconsciously that the fact that the Soviets were planning to put a man around the moon before the end of the year in their Zond spacecraft had some influence. Now, if you talk to some senior NASA officials at that time, they say, no, that had nothing to do with it.
The Russians had everything to do with it. We were coming into the last lap, and we'd be damned if we were going to lose this thing now. So the decision was made. Our very next flight, Apollo 8, would go all the way out to the moon.
Apollo 8 was the boldest decision we made in the space program, period, at any time. It was the cardinal step to landing men on the moon.
In 7 years of space flight, no one, not us, not the Russians, had ever gone beyond Earth orbit. This was the moon we were talking about. Deep space. A whole new ball game. 8 months of work done in 4. But this wasn't go fever. This time we really thought we could do it. Mission commander would be Frank Borman.
A lot of people got cold feet, and I had to keep reminding people, well, you designed this thing to go to the moon. Now we're ready to go to the moon, and you're gun shy. Why? It's ready or it's not ready.
Borman's crew included rookie Bill Anders and Jim Lovell, Frank's old Gemini sidekick.
Frank came back and told us, and so we were all elated. I thought that, yeah, this is the way to go. This is much better than going around the Earth for a second time with Frank Borman. I mean, I didn't think that was really necessary, but it was a much better flight to go to the moon with Frank.
But still, there was something about shooting the moon that made you think twice.
My wife, Susan, was convinced that we would not return from the moon, and she was, in her state of mind, was planning a memorial service without a body and was really quite convinced that she would lose her husband on the Apollo 8 flight. But I didn't realize that she had these grave reservations, because if she would have exhibited reservations, I loved her deeply, and it would have made a big impact on how I approached. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say I would have withdrawn, but I probably would have, I would have had a lot more anguish in trying to, instead of the gung-ho attitude that I had.
9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on.
We'd done everything we knew how to do. There was nothing left but to shoot the moon.
We have commit. We have...
The clock is running. Roger, good.
51 a.m. standard time. We have cleared the tower.
Program. Roger. Ready here, Houston. Right, clear. All right, you are go for TLI, over. Roger, understand. We're go for TLI.
TLI, Translunar Injection, a command we'd never given before. It meant we were ready to send them out of Earth orbit, off into deep space, and toward the moon.
Following Houston, you're looking good here, right down the center line. Roger, Apollo 8.
Approaching the moon, our blunt end was towards the moon, so we really didn't see the moon as it got bigger and bigger. The ground called up and said that at such and such a time, and they gave it right down to the second, we'll lose communication because the moon's gravity will pull you around to the far side. Exactly at the time that they said, right to the second, we did lose communication, had static in our earphones. We looked out, though, but we could not see any moon.
We were upside down and backwards in perfect darkness.
We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit. There's a chair in this room. This is Apollo Control Houston, switching now to the voice of Jim Lovell.
Welcome from the moon, Houston.
Thank you.
The moon is a different thing to each one of us. I know my own impression is that it's a vast, lonely, forbidding type existence.
It's incredible. That was, to me, the one point in the mission where I thought, my God, what a team put us here. Here, we've gone 240,000 miles, and at the exact second we're supposed to see this, there it is. It was disbelief. Disbelief.
I think that we were like three school kids looking into a candy store window. Our noses were pressed against the window, and we looked at those ancient old craters as they slid on by, and forgot the flight plan for a while, and forgot really how dangerous this all was, because it was really something unique.
They didn't know it, but they hadn't seen anything yet.
Well, that moment was incredible when you looked and saw the Earth flying over the lunar horizon and realized that everything that we valued was back on the Earth, and it was the only thing in the whole universe that had any color. It was blue and white, and you could even see the kind of pinkish-brown continents. That was more, to me, that was a greater impact than the moon.
Anders was in charge of photography, and he was taking pictures of the craters on the moon. Frank and I both saw the Earth come up and thought that it was a great time to take a picture of not only the Earth, but the lunar horizon in the foreground. So we mentioned that, but Bill said, hey, we only got so many frames of film, and we got to spend them, taking pictures of craters here on the moon. And then, of course, Bill looked up, and he saw what we were looking at, and he said, by gosh, we got to take a picture of that. All three of us, of course, grabbed cameras. All three of us took pictures. One of them, of course, became quite famous. I think it's known as Earthrise. It was made into a stamp in 1969. Now, if you travel and you run into Frank Borman, be sure to ask Frank who took the picture, because Frank will look at you and very seriously say, listen, I was the commander. Obviously, it's my photo. He even put it in this book that he wrote.
I don't know. Anders says he did. I said I did. I don't know. I honestly don't know who took it.
Let me tell the truth. I really took the picture.
Lovell's the only one we know for sure didn't.
The pictures coming back from Apollo 8 made the whole world stop for a moment. I couldn't help but think how ironic it was. At the moment of our greatest success in space, America was coming apart.
We were so immersed in the mission. The terrible events of '68 didn't even leave a big impression on me. It was as if there was another world.
Mike, what I keep imagining is if I'm some lonely traveler from another planet, what I'd think about the Earth from this altitude, whether I'd think it'd be inhabited or not.
It was December 1968, and Christmas couldn't come too soon.
We were told, I guess maybe a month before the flight, that we were going to have this huge television audience from around the moon on Christmas Eve and to do something appropriate. To me, that was an annoyance. I didn't even want to take a television camera because I thought that would detract from the flight. As we got to the moment in the flight plan after we'd been viewing the Earth and the moon, we thought, my goodness, this is so appropriate, because we felt like we were looking at the beginning of a planet that hadn't really achieved life, and yet here in the background was the one that had.
For all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light.
I had an enormous feeling that there had to be a power greater than any of us, that there was a God, that there was indeed a beginning, and that maybe even our choosing to read from Genesis wasn't a haphazard thing, that maybe it had been ordained some way.
And from the crew good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
We all felt how far we'd come. It had been 10 years since we'd started. Gus would have been proud. He never did make it to the moon, but without him, we wouldn't have gotten this close when we did. We'd gone around the moon. All that was left was the landing. But that wasn't going to be easy.